Mr. Forbes, do you recall your response to hearing President Reagan call the Soviet Union an evil empire? Where were you and how did you learn of it? Can you tell us what your reaction was?
Well, I heard of it soon after he made the statement, and at the time, some people were very critical of it. But by calling it what it was, he was absolutely right, and I think people around the world, especially what we used to call the Iron Curtain, were astounded that somebody could speak so directly and so truthfully about an empire, and it was an empire, that literally killed tens of millions of people, that oppressed people, destroyed the native genius of the Russian people and peoples under their rule. So by doing that, I think it also told the world that this was a different president who wasn't just going to go along because it was there, that he was going to try to truly roll it back and win the Cold War. And I think that's why Moscow at the time was so appalled by it, not that they were hurt by words, but they realized the full implications. This was a very different president from any other of the post-World War II American presidents.
When you heard that President Reagan's policy was no longer containment, that we would no longer contain communism, the West would transcend communism, was that an unexpected statement? Did you expect this coming from Reagan?
Well, one would have hoped that such a statement would come, because we often know that in political life, what individuals may say on the campaign trail often changes when they are faced by the realities of power. And that was the genius of Ronald Reagan, was that he was fully appreciative that you just don't say something and have it happen. But he also understood the power of ideas. He also understood moral clarity in a way that many leaders do not. And by saying evil empire, by saying containment is not going to be the policy of this administration, he meant we're not going to send tanks into East Germany or something like that, but he understood that we can, through the power of the American ideal, through reviving the American economy, through supporting those who were fighting the dissidents, who were fighting the dissidents in Eastern Europe, who were fighting, we used to call Eastern Europe, now Eastern Central Europe, who were fighting Soviet totalitarianism. He understood that that is how you can get profound change. And whether it was the speech that he gave before Parliament in 1982 and other occasions, tear down this wall, evil empire, it's told the world this is a different America. And he understood Lincoln's words, right makes might. And by building up the American military, it wasn't just there, muscle-bound. It told the world freedom was ascendant again after a terrible decade in the 1970s, malaise, American retreat around the world. America was very different. And I think that inspired people to bring about the change in the Soviet Union. People say, well, it was going to fall inevitably anyway. No. Look at North Korea, starved millions of people to death, utterly bankrupt regime. Still there. Same with Cuba. Ronald Reagan understood you have to make things happen. They just don't happen.
Hear, hear. Has the Reagan presidency influenced your leadership style?
The Reagan presidency, I think, is an influence on all leadership styles, in the sense that, like a true leader, and while times and circumstances change, principles of effective leadership do not. Ronald Reagan was an innovator. For example, his ideas on drastically reducing taxes, simplifying the tax code, came when he was in his late 60s. So he had a constantly fertile mind, that even though he had basic principles, he also understood you have to be open to ideas and how to affect those principles, how to make reality of economic growth, opportunity, freedom. And he also understood no one is master of the universe. No one is supreme dictator where you can say, do this, do that. He understood how to make things happen. And he learned from his mistakes in California and in Washington. And that is also an effective leader. You're going to have crises. You're going to sometimes do things that have unintended consequences. But you don't fold your tent and let that break your spirit. You figure out how to learn from it, regroup, and live to fight another day. And he also understood, because life has jigs and jags and detours, you can't always push straight ahead. But if you don't lose sight of what your ultimate goals are, you can make them come to pass in a very imperfect world.
When did you first meet him?
I first met Ronald Reagan back in the 1970s. I never had an opportunity to meet him when he was governor of California, but after he stepped down as governor after 2 terms, there were various occasions when I could meet him, but I never had a real conversation with him until in later years, first just before he ran for president, or before he got the Republican nomination, and then several times as president, and many times, thankfully, after he left the White House. And like Abraham Lincoln, Ronald Reagan was an effective user of stories. He knew how to tell stories to make a point or to deflect something. He was a master at it. He had hundreds of them. And I just heard one the other day, and I'll have to share it with you. You can edit it out if you want. But he was asked about, what about all the infighting on your staff and this fighting between Chief of Staff and Secretary of State and this, that, and the other thing? How do you cope with that and still be an effective leader? And he told a story about the 2 psychiatrists. One was an older psychiatrist and the other was a younger psychiatrist. And they went to work together. At the end of the day, the younger one was bedraggled, emotionally drained. Just, you could tell he'd been through a terrible day listening to all this tale of woe. And the older one always seemed as serene at the end of the day as he began the day. And so finally the younger psychiatrist asked the older one, he said, well, how do you do it? And the older one replied, I don't listen.
I thought all of them. I've never heard that one. That is a good one. Oh gosh, that is really great. Love it. Well, it provides a good segue, too. In 1985, President Reagan named you chairman of the Bipartisan Board for International Broadcasting. Knowing that you would oversee the operation of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, what were your biggest challenges and how did you overcome them? And what do you consider your greatest achievement?
Well, when I was privileged to take over oversight of the operations of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, amazingly, there are a lot of people in Congress who wanted to shut them down, who considered them relics of the early Cold War years, that this was a more sophisticated era. And so we had constant battles. And people in the press and the media, many of them were hostile to it. There was a lot of what you might call anti-communism sentiment at the time. And so keeping these things going, making reforms. There had been some operational problems. The one thing you learned about the Europeans is that the various nationalities would always be fighting one another and all that kind of thing. But so we had constant funding problems, constant battles of people who wanted to do stories to do us in. Nice thing about Ronald Reagan was he understood the power of ideas. He'd been in radio. And the nice thing about radio is it's relatively cheap. And he understood, Reagan, even though he built up our military, he did so with the hope you don't have to use these weapons. But he also understood you can fight the battle of ideas each and every day. And that's what made those 2 radios so effective, was precisely that it was fighting these battle of ideas. We're breaking the monopoly of information. He understood you have to break that monopoly of information if these regimes are going to truly be undermined. And so the contrast, not contrast, but the difference between us and, say, Voice of America was that we had radio stations that tried to replicate what you would have if that country was free. So we'd focus on internal events in those countries in a way, and not just about America, but internal events in those countries as if we were in Warsaw, as if we were in Prague, Bucharest, and elsewhere. And so that's what ultimately we were able to beef up the broadcasting, make great improvements. And I think when Lech Walesa was asked in 1989 about Radio Free Europe, he was asked how important was it, and he replied with a question. He said, what is the earth without the sun? The radios enabled people inside to know that others inside the country and inside the region knew they were there, knew they were fighting. It's very difficult to fight if you feel you're isolated and alone. But if you know that there are other groups and other individuals out there who have the same goals as you do, Why, it gives you heart, it gives you strength. And solidarity, for example, in Poland was given a lot of strength during the 1980s. And so we did play a part in bringing down the Soviet Empire through the power of ideas, through the flow of information, and precisely because of Reagan's background. He knew the power of ideas. He was an ideas individual himself. He was very interested, had a great intellect in that area, and knew how they shape how we see the world. They're the lenses through which we see the world. And that if you can make an impact there, it's not like buying an aircraft carrier, but by golly, it can have enormous impact. And so we integrated fighting the war of ideas, but also with military might that brought it all together. And the most amazing thing is that the Soviet Empire fell without a catastrophic war. And even as they killed tens of millions of people, a century of 2 world wars, that a totalitarian system could collapse like that is astonishing. And yes, others were involved, Gorbachev and Pope John Paul II and Margaret Thatcher and others. But if it hadn't been for Reagan's leadership, this would not have happened. We would not be celebrating this 20th anniversary.
One of the things I found interesting today in speaking to some of the other leaders of the Baltic countries is this whole issue of information and ideas. How in a repressive totalitarian society, when you're told over and over that you have enough freedom and that you have enough food, all you need is security and a strong government, there comes a complacency and a sort of a self-hypnotized state where they think everything is okay. So penetrating and getting those ideas into their hands is a huge challenge. And they were scrambling your signals, right? How did you get the message to them? And did you have intelligence that confirmed that you were getting it to them? I mean, we know from people like Valenza that yes, it was important. But so how did you get it to them, and how did you know you were making headway?
Well, you could get around the jamming, and there won't get into the engineering principles, but there are a certain number of hours a day where no matter how intense the jamming, you could get the broadcast through. And so if you wanted to hear the signal, you could eventually find a way to do it. And in terms of assessing how effective you were, a number of people did from Eastern Central Europe, and indeed the Soviet Union itself, visited the West. And there are ways you can engage in conversation and get a sense of what kind of listenership you had. And then with the rise of telephones, you could call Munich, and people could get through. You knew through the flow what they call Samizdat literature. There's a whole library of underground material that was circulating. And so yes, we knew from people in solidarity that the signals were getting through, and that hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people were listening. And we never made the mistake of thinking you have to have a large audience. What we wanted was an audience of people who wanted to make a change, who wanted to get the information. We know those were the kinds of people who could bring about or help set up the conditions for a major change inside these countries. And just one point of clarification on Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty was that Radio Free Europe was broadcast to what we used to call satellite nations, captured nations like Poland, Hungary, Romania, and the like, whereas Radio Liberty was geared to the Soviet Union. And one of the statements that Radio Free Europe made was that we had broadcast services for Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. We did not recognize their forced incorporation into the Soviet Union that happened in 1939, 1940. And I remember we were finally allowed to go to the Soviet Union in 1988. There was change in the air. We had to go under the umbrella of Voice of America, since that was an official government agency. That was the cover that they'd get to allow us in, since ostensibly we're an independent group. and seen as the vicious enemy. So you knew change was coming when we were allowed to go in for a series of meetings. And I felt something was happening when we met with our Soviet counterparts. I deliberately began my opening statement by distinguishing, they already knew it, between Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe, and mentioning the Baltic states as part of Radio Free Europe, seeing if they'd go ballistic as they would in the past. They just demurred, say no, it's part of it. They didn't throw us out, they didn't walk away. I knew something was happening.
You must have loved it.
Yeah, it was amazing.
That had to be a high point.
Yeah. So Ronald Reagan was doing something right. That was clear.
Did you, also like Walensa, talking about Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, said that it was, critical to the struggle against communism. Did you ever think you'd have the opportunity in your lifetime to be so influential?
The answer is no, not like that. And did I foresee that the Soviet Union empire would collapse as quickly as it did? No. I knew that we were putting it under severe pressure. That's the thing about life. You have to be prepared for contingencies. You don't know when these things might happen, but it doesn't mean you don't try to happen. It's like risk-taking in a business venture. You don't know whether it's going to work or not or how long it's going to take. But if you're not out there probing, pushing, you don't know when it's going to happen, but you have to keep trying to do it. And so it would happen much sooner than I thought it was, but I was heartened that I could, since I appreciate the importance of ideas, I was heartened that there was a president who understood that you can fight a battle of ideas, that there was more to diplomacy than just meeting, clinking glasses, and coming to agreements, that you do try to change how people see the world, and when you do, you change the world.
As a member of the press, what were the Forbes family's observations of restricted free speech in the Soviet Union? What are your thoughts on the progress that Russia has made, and what are the weak spots?
Well, Russia is never an easy country. Churchill talked about enigmas wrapped in mystery, whatever. It's a complicated place. It's had a bloody history. And several years ago, we started with a partner with Axel Springer in a licensing agreement where we had an edition of Forbes in Russian, Forbes Russia, in 2004. And the first editor was a man named Paul Klebnikov, a man of Russian descent. He was born in the United States, but his grandparents came out of Russia, and he could speak Russian fluently and did superb stories over the year. And so he wanted to be the first editor of this, so he went over in 2004. And a few months after he was there, he was murdered, contract murder. And we never found out what he was working on that precipitated the killing. And of course, his killers were never brought to justice and imprisoned and punished. But we decided to keep publishing there, and the publication is doing well because it's seen as one of the few that people can turn to that is trustworthy. And so Russia is now in a period where the government is becoming more powerful, and this was after Putin did some good things 8 or 9 years ago in terms of simplifying the tax code and making some other reforms. But they have fallen into the trap of thinking, I think, thinking that natural resources are the real source of wealth. And it's not. It's the human mind. And Russia does have considerable intellectual resources, especially among the young people. They have they've traditionally been very good at music and math and the sciences. And so there's no reason why that country shouldn't be doing better economically. So eventually I think changes will come. But it's not going to be a straight path. And so as Reagan did, as Paul Klebnikov did, you keep trying to do what you can, and see how it falls out. But no success is guaranteed and no timetable is guaranteed, but that doesn't mean you don't persist.
Oh. Switching topics, although completely interrelated, in the museum it's important for us to explain Reagan's economic policy and its success. Obviously, well, it's easy to set up what the country was like in 1980. But we have 15-year-old kids and 10-year-old kids who come through the museum, and we need to explain to them what it was that Ronald Reagan did, what his economic policies were that brought our economy, brought life back into our economy. So if you had to explain them, how would you do that?
Well, obviously, depending on the age.
Yeah.
I think one of the ways you do it, one is illustrations, long lines to get gasoline. Why? You can have illustrations on constantly rising prices. Why? And then what you've done with the Oval Office, where you have kids come in and make decisions on Grenada, and whether you leak from the press information about an upcoming military operation. If you illustrate to a youngster, would you work on a Monday if everything you earned was taxed away, or Tuesday where nothing is taxed away? Kids get that pretty quickly. Work on Tuesday, why bother to work on Monday? Well, if you have a country where you're punished for working, are you going to work as hard? Not really. And you can illustrate Ronald Reagan's observations when income taxes in this country went up to over 90%. The accountants told him, don't make more than 2 movies a year. You make more, you're working for nothing. And so it frustrated him that here he wanted to do more, but was told that the tax code made it irrelevant. He would be punished for wanting to work. Well, kids get that. He could do 4 movies a year, but he's restricted to 2. That doesn't make much sense. So people get basic principles. Starting a business, why make it difficult? It's like if you want to trade cards or you want to go online. Imagine if you have to go through 17 steps to go online or go on Facebook. You'd say, well, that makes it difficult. I probably would only do it once a day if I had to go through 17 steps. Well, in many countries, that's what you had to go through to start a legal business. Instead of doing it, you want to go online, you do it. Why have to go through all of these steps and licenses? And so people then begin to understand these rules have an impact on what you can do. So if you bring it down to relate it to activities that they're engaged in, what enabled the invention of the internet was taken out of the Defense Department, where it was a system of communication between universities, allowing people to develop ways that you never thought before. Take the computer. You can have a mainframe computer, say they're now small, but that's what they once looked like, originally invented to help calculate the trajectories of artillery shells in World War II. Well, it had more applications than artillery in the military. And went out in the private sector, first for filing and everything else, it became something that's absolutely indispensable for the standard of living we have today. And again, just compare the size of a room where you had one of those early UNIVAC systems, ENIAC as they originally called the thing, and then look at a handheld today and say this is more powerful than that big machine with people actually walking around, putting a plug in one area and another area, keep these beasts going. I think kids would be astonished, or even show a cell phone. Well, what it was 15 years ago, big clunky thing, bigger than your shoe, and what you have in your hand today, which does far more things than this big clunky thing could do, and a fraction of the cost. Well, it just doesn't happen. People make it happen. They have to be allowed to make it happen.
Absolutely. Do you recall where you were when the wall went up?
I was, the wall went up in, when John
August
Kennedy was,
1961,
John Kennedy was president. I was on summer vacation, and I think it was in Wyoming, just gotten out of summer school. I had to do that in those days. When it went up, and there's speculation, what would we do? And when we did nothing, it seemed like, wow, because at the time, you forget today, at least 3,000 East Germans a day were going into West Berlin, and then thence to what we used to call West Germany. And literally people were bleeding out of the country. And so the Russians put it up, the Soviets put it up, precisely because they realized their satellite, East Germany, was going to cease to exist. It was just going to be depopulated, losing 1 million people a year. And so you realize this was an ugly thing. It just brought home the nature of communism. But literally, they're going to put up a wall, not to keep invaders out, but to keep their own populace in. Astonishing turn of events.
It was. I have everything I need.
Great.
Thank you so much. This
Thank
is just
you.
great.